I wish I could be there. Wish I could be there in person, of course. I'm going to read this. I apologise for that. I've not read a paper for a long time. But my efforts thus far at presenting with PowerPoint on Zoom have gone, if not horribly wrong, certainly not as well as they might have done. So I wanted to spare you that. It's kind of difficult doing that, balancing a laptop on your knee. And so I just thought I'll give a relatively detailed handout and then read, hopefully slowly, through the paper and then go to questions. So yeah, I wouldn't normally read out, but hopefully this goes okay. And the paper is a bit of a departure. I've written on pride before, but I was asked to write something on humility for a volume, and then I noticed an interesting puzzle that they seemed to me to be a lot closer than I initially thought, certainly in terms of structure, and that raised a particular puzzle for me, at least, about their value. So that's the starting point for the paper. So okay, here goes. Humility is held to be more valuable, more morally praiseworthy than pride. Some make this point in terms of virtues, that humility counts as virtuous, whilst pride, if not a vice, fails to be a virtue. There are, of course, those who disagree with such a ranking. Aristotle is one notable example of someone who seems to have had an opposing assessment of the value of these states. But on the whole, philosophers and common sense opinion converge in thinking better of those who are humble than they do of those who are proud. This raises a puzzle, however, for there are considerable similarities between pride and humility. Both, for instance, involve a relation to something that's good or valuable. Both have an appraisal structure that reflects this relation, and both function to communicate this relation to others, and so have an essentially social nature. Given this, those who think humility virtuous whilst pride is not are faced with a problem, namely the problem of explaining this difference in our rankings of them by appealing to some other feature or condition that suffices to distinguish the two. In this paper, I'll argue that a number of recent attempts to explain what humility is, and in so doing, explain why humility is virtuous, fail on this account. In the final section, I'll suggest a more plausible solution can be found if we locate the relevant difference in how these emotions are expressed, and in particular, in the respective demands that such expressions make on us. We'll see that whereas the communication of pride requires us to make a particular response, to esteem and give deference to the proud person, the communication of humility permits but does not require such an attitude. Because of this, I argue, humility allows us to bestow gifts of esteem on the humble person in a way which we find agreeable, but also in a way that itself expresses respect for our freedom. As a result, we not only find humility more agreeable than pride, it also seems to embody a more valuable, because more respectful, motive. Or so, at least, I'll argue. So, first section, preliminaries, and this is first section on the handout. And the first distinction is between pride and humility as episodes and also as traits. And we talk of pride and humility in these ways. A caveat, I'll switch between talking of humility and modesty. I think the majority of philosophers think these are pretty much the same. Some people don't. I think Michael Slope thinks they're different. But I'm going to regard humility and modesty as the same thing and talk of them interchangeably. Okay, so we talk of pride and humility as episodes, but also as traits. That someone might experience feelings of pride in a particular instance, when she's receiving her degree certificate, let's say. And the same person might experience instances of humility or modesty when she's asked afterwards about her achievement, for example. We also talk of humble or modest people, and mean by this those who are disposed to be humble or modest in the right circumstances. Things are a little more complicated when we talk of proud people, which might be one reason why the latter is often regarded as of dubious value. For calling someone a proud person seems to imply that they have an overly rigid and perhaps exaggerated view of their own standing and qualities. We sometimes say that people are too proud to do manual labour, or too proud to be seen in that pub or with those people, too proud for their own good, and so on. Our puzzle would be easily solved if we pointed out the difference between the modest person and someone who's proud in this kind of way. But the puzzle remains, I think, when we focus on episodes of pride and humility, and so to avoid complications associated with pride as a potentially dubious, long-standing character trait, I'll focus on the former. Cases where, for instance, a tennis player is proud of his victory, or a musician is humble or modest about her performance. That's the first distinction I want to make. I also think that pride and humility are, in the episodic sense, emotions or emotional experiences. We talk easily of feelings of pride and equally of feeling humble or humbled. And so the episodes have associated affective elements. As we'll see, pride and humility have a particular appraisal structure. They involve evaluations of the world and of oneself. They embody ways of seeing or perceiving value. Pride and humility have effects on attention and other cognitions. They incline us towards certain behaviours, and they have associated facial and bodily expressions. Since emotions are standardly characterised just in terms of this collection of elements or components, it's plausible to think that pride and humility are also therefore emotional. Thirdly, pride and humility need to be distinguished from their respective close relations. Pride should be distinguished from arrogance, which is associated with being unpleasantly or overbearingly proud, and self-aggrandizement, which is associated with aggressively promoting one's own power and accomplishments. Again, it would be too easy a solution to our puzzle to castigate pride by aligning it to one of these vices. But if one is tempted by this argumentative line, note that we can do the same with humility, for we can equally well distinguish humility from timidity, which is associated with a lack of confidence or courage, and self-deprecation, which is associated with belittling or disparaging oneself. These are vices too, but it's no strike against humility that it can be mistakenly associated with such things. With these preliminaries in mind, let us outline the nature of pride and humility and highlight the important similarities between them. Similarities which I think generate the problem of distinguishing them in terms of their value. So section 2, similarities between pride and humility. There are many different accounts of pride, but what most have in common is a certain appraisal structure. Roughly, pride involves an appraisal or assessment of an object or event as, firstly, valuable, and secondly, as related in some way to oneself. A prominent and plausible account of pride is due to Gabrielle Taylor, who writes, and this is on the handout, a person who experiences pride believes that she stands in the relation of belonging to some object or person, deed, state, which she thinks desirable in some respect. This is the general description of the explanatory beliefs. It is because, in her view, this relation holds between her and the desirable object that she believes her worth to be increased in the relevant respect. This belief is constitutive of the feeling of pride. The gap between the explanatory and identificatory beliefs is bridged by the belief that her connection to the thing in question is itself of value or is an achievement of hers. So in Taylor's view, there seem to be three conditions for pride. First, pride is dependent. We feel pride as a response to some object or event that, in our eyes at least, constitutes a positive value. Second, we must regard the valuable object or event as standing in some relation to us. As Jeremy Fisher puts it, experiencing the emotion of pride requires that we view ourselves as standing in some special relation to the object of our emotion. In Taylor's terms, this relation can be a broad one, such as belonging. She writes, "It is in virtue of belonging to the same family, the same country or institution, that people are proud of their ancestors, countrymen, or colleagues." Third, and this will be important as we go on, the proud person must regard her standing in this relation as something that is itself valuable, as a source of self-worth or esteem. So it's not simply the fact that one stands in a relation of belonging to something of value that suffices for pride. I might, after all, not feel pride about my family's super yacht, despite its value and my relation to it, since I regard such ostentatious displays of wealth to be immoral, to be something to be ashamed about. The proud person must therefore regard the fact that she is in a relation with something of value as bearing positively on her worth. Together, these three beliefs, or perhaps cognitions that fall short of beliefs, or ways of seeing, make up the complex appraisal that's distinctive of pride. And without these three beliefs or appraisals, our feeling would fail to be an instance or an episode of pride. What then of humility? As with pride, there are a variety of different accounts of humility, and we'll see some recent accounts shortly. What nearly all accounts of humility seem to have in common is something noted by Michael Sloat, namely that humility is also dependent upon some other good, and so, like pride, is a relational state. As Nicholas Bomarito puts it, being modest requires some other good quality for us to be modest about. We might capture this dependent or relational aspect of modesty by proposing that it too has a particular appraisal structure. Humility, like pride, must involve thinking or believing that one stands in a relation to some good or value. As with pride, the good or value might not be something that the person themselves have brought about. There's responsibilist accounts of pride, but I don't think they're particularly plausible. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to be proud of your university or its achievements, historical achievements, things that you didn't bring about, you weren't responsible for. People are often humble or modest about their own qualities and achievements, but this need not be the case. I can be modest about the achievements of my children or the prestige of my university. This means that the first two conditions for pride are mirrored for humility. We feel humility in relation to some valuable object or event or quality, and we regard the object, etc., as standing in some relation to us. Following Taylor, we might think that this is, once again, a relation of belonging. To this point, then, we've not encountered any real difference between pride and modesty, at least at the level of appraisal structure. Both involve thinking about the relation between oneself and something of value in a particular way. What of the third condition, though? Do pride and humility differ here? Some might be tempted to think so, and maintain that whereas pride requires the thought or belief that the relation in question bears positively on one's standing, humility doesn't involve any such appraisal. Indeed, some might go further and claim that humility cannot involve thinking of the relation in this way, that it is a necessary condition on being modest or humble that one does not have this belief. This would be a version of an ignorance account of the concept. As Bomarito states, such accounts explain modesty by appeal to states that are epistemically defective in some way. The modest person either lacks certain beliefs about their own goodness or has false beliefs that involve underrating themselves. End quote. So on this view, the modest person must be ignorant of the fact that her standing in a relation to something of value speaks well of her, enhances her standing in the eyes of others. Now, I think there are a couple of problems with this line. First, it seems unduly restrictive. There seems little reason other than adherence to the theory to suppose that the modest person cannot have a belief about how the relation in question enhances her standing. Consider, it's at least possible, and indeed reasonably likely, given how he conducts himself in interview, that Andy Murray is a modest person. But he's surely aware of how his tennis prowess and achievements are viewed by his fellow Scots. Modesty surely cannot require Andy Murray to be puzzled when he keeps winning awards and public acclaim. Second, it's not at all obvious how lacking the belief in question makes the modest person better or more virtuous than someone who is proud of his achievements and who is aware of the relation that bears positively on his standing. Whatever the reason we prefer those who are modest to those who are proud, clearly lack of the relevant belief isn't it. If so, it's plausible to suppose that pride and modesty have the same kind of appraisal structure, at least to the extent that they share the same three conditions explained. How then might we explain the difference in the evaluative status that pride and humility have? In the next section, I'll examine some recent ways of answering this question and argue that none of them are convincing. Is it going too quickly or too slowly? I'm quite happy to speed up if people want.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
Right, okay. I'll have a sip of tea and then next section. Okay, section 3. Modesty as hedonic indifference, kindness, and inattention. And these will be three different accounts of what modesty or humility are, accounts which purport to explain why it's virtuous, and which I'm going to argue don't do the job. So, suppose we move away from doxastic accounts, which focus on some putative epistemic difference between the states, and look to some non-doxastic element in order to solve our puzzle. In this section, I'll examine accounts which appeal to differences in pleasure, kindness, and attention, in attempting to show why humility, but not pride, counts as virtuous. Subsection 1. Even if pride and humility share a certain appraisal structure, one rather obvious difference between them is at the level of hedonics. This is because pride would seem to involve a subject taking pleasure in the fact that the relevant relation bears positively on their standing, whilst the humble subject does not. In support of the former, note that the typical facial expression of pride is one in which the subject seems pleased with herself and her achievement. Pride and pleasure seem very closely linked, therefore. Not so with humility, which some want to characterize in terms of a lack of any pleasure. Indeed, a number of accounts of humility highlight precisely that it involves an indifference to the fact that one's relation to some good bears positively on one's standing. On this account, it's the fact that one fails to take pleasure in the relevant fact that makes the person virtuous. Conversely, those who are proud fail to be virtuous precisely because they take pleasure in the fact of their relation to some good. So does this account solve our puzzle? I don't think so. For one thing, the pleasure that pride involves is often entirely fitting from a moral perspective. Suppose that Lucy has just been made captain of the school football team. Lucy and others would expect Lucy's parents to be beaming with pride at this achievement. This is not just an expectation reflective of how parents tend to react in cases like this. There would be something morally and normatively amiss if Lucy's parents didn't take pleasure in this fact. Think of how Lucy might feel. So taking pleasure in achievement that is suitably related to one cannot be the reason why we think that pride isn't virtuous. Indeed, there's theoretical backing for this intuitive take on Lucy's situation. Consider Thomas Herker's work on the nature of virtue. In his book Virtue, Vice and Value, Herker proposes and defends a recursive characterization of good and evil. This characterization involves a number of clauses. For our purposes, two are particularly important. The first is a recursion clause about the intrinsic goodness of a certain attitude to what is good, namely loving it, or more specifically, loving for itself what is good. And this is the clause LG on the handout. If X is intrinsically good, loving X, desiring, pursuing, or taking pleasure in X for itself is also intrinsically good. Now, Herker supplements this with a clause about indifference to goods, IG. If X is intrinsically good, being indifferent to X, neither loving nor hating X when, given one's cognitive states, one could do so for itself, is intrinsically evil. Herker claims further that the moral virtues are those attitudes to goods and evils that are themselves intrinsically good, and the moral vices are those attitudes to goods and evils that are intrinsically evil. So on this view, it is virtuous to take pleasure in something that's good, and vicious to be indifferent to something that's good. On the assumption that enhancement in social standing is a good, it would follow from Herker's recursive account that pride is virtuous precisely on the grounds that it involves pleasure. Herker's not alone in taking virtue to be a way of favouring what is good. Robert Adams holds something similar, claiming, I identify virtue with persisting excellence in being for the good. Linda Zagzebski also holds that virtues involve positive attitudes towards goods and negative attitudes towards evils, embodied in the emotional responses that constitute the motivational components of virtue. Indeed, virtue theorists in general, no doubt influenced by Aristotle to some extent, deny that taking pleasure in virtuous activity in any sense undermines the virtuous status of that activity. If so, it's difficult to see how pride falls short of virtue on hedonic grounds. The appeal to pleasure as a differentiating element fails to answer our puzzle, therefore. A different approach appeals not to pleasure, but to kindness. Consider in this light Alan Wilson's 2014 paper in Ratio, Modesty as Kindness. Wilson thinks that accounts of modesty, which restrict themselves to features internal to an agent, such as beliefs about their own abilities or comparisons with others, allow, quote, for the agent to be both proud and obnoxiously boastful about some ability that they possess. For Wilson, what is needed is an external requirement, a restriction of how the truly modest agent will behave in their interactions with other people. Wilson's own requirement involves kindness, and this quote I think is on the handout as well. So Wilson says, my suggestion is that the trait of modesty ought to be considered as closely related to the more fundamental virtue of kindness. It is at least part of the nature of kindness that the agent will be concerned to protect and promote the well-being of others. The modest agent is one who shares this concern and who is influenced by it in the way that they present themselves. To be modest is to be disposed to present your accomplishments or positive attributes in a way that is sensitive to the potential negative impact on the well-being of others, where this disposition stems from a concern for that well-being. End quote. Wilson thinks that this allows us to explain why modesty is virtuous. Part of the explanation here is that the modest person, being kind, will be concerned not to undermine the esteem of others, and so will avoid, quote, bragging and boasting about their achievements. As a result, a humble person is unlikely to provoke envy and dislike in others, and so will maintain cordial social relations. Since this is a good end, then modesty will be reliably connected with this end. But the main reason for viewing modesty in a positive light is because of its close relation to an overriding or overarching virtue. Wilson writes, quote, the modest agent is concerned to protect and promote the well-being of others through their self-preservation, and so will be likely to also possess the virtue of kindness. This, on his view, helps us to explain the value of episodes of modesty as well. For insofar as particular instances of modesty will express the feelings that the kind and therefore virtuous person is disposed to have. Episodes of modesty count as virtue for this reason. I think there's a lot that's attractive about Wilson's account, and I think unfortunately it suffers from a couple of problems. First, it seems to be too narrow in its focus on the potential negative impact on the well-being of others. Consider Andy Murray again. I take it Andy Murray can be modest when he's motivated to downplay his impressiveness, even in situations where there's little or no chance of negative impact on the well-being or esteem of others. Suppose, for instance, he's at dinner celebrating Grand Slam winners since 2010. Surely it's possible for Andy to be modest, and yet rightly unconcerned with the effect that his talking about his accomplishments might have on the well-being of Serena Williams and Novak Djokovic. So his motivation to downplay his achievements here cannot be kindness to them. Secondly, and importantly, the appeal to kindness doesn't really help us to solve our puzzle. This is because pride can equally fit Wilson's definition. The proud person can also be disposed to present her accomplishments or positive attributes in a way that's sensitive to the potential impact on the well-being of others, where this disposition stems from a concern for that well-being. The proud person might sometimes be disposed to display pride because of the positive impact this will have on the well-being of others. Think again of Lucy's proud parents being sensitive to the benefit such an emotional expression brings to their daughter, or sensitive to the harm that their failure to express pride in Lucy's achievements might cause. This point is not simply restricted to cases where someone is proud of a family member or another in a relation of belonging. Olympic athletes on the winner's podium might rightly display pride out of a sensitivity to the sacrifices that their trainers have made, or the financial support of their funding bodies, or to the applause and adulation of the crowd, or indeed the nation. Failure to display pride in such cases might be evidence of mean-spiritedness or a lack of public concern, a kind of churlishness. A disposition to feel pride, no less than modesty, can therefore express kindness and sensitivity to the well-being of others. As a result, an appeal to kindness gets us no further in solving our puzzle. A third recent approach, due to Nicholas Bomarito, grounds the value of modesty in certain patterns of attention. Like Wilson, Bomarito thinks that, quote, a good theory will provide a framework that helps us see what is good about modesty and what is bad about immodesty. Now, Bomarito thinks that what's essential to modesty is that we direct our attention in certain ways, and that as a result, modesty is a virtue of attention. In particular, he claims that the modest person will direct her attention away from the trait or its value, or towards the outside causes and conditions that played a role in developing it. Sorry, to repeat that. Bomarito claims that the modest person will direct her attention away from the trait or its value, or toward the outside causes and conditions that played a role in developing it. So a modest person might not attend to the fact that she's a skillful driver, or to the value of her architectural designs. She might instead focus on the vital role that others have played in enabling her to fulfill her talents in these ways and to achieve what she does. But these patterns of attention are not sufficient for modesty. Instead, the modest person's attention must be directed in one of these ways for the right reasons, as a result of their values or desires. In the case of someone who attends to external factors and their role in enabling her to exhibit her skill, attention is governed by her concern for the importance of family, friends, and society. And so her attention seems to be virtuous as a result. By the same token, someone might be inattentive to her abilities or to the value of these because she lacks certain morally problematic, for example, narcissistic desires or concerns. It is the absence of negative values or desires that makes inattention in these cases virtuous. And for Bomarito, it's this feature which also helps to explain why modesty is a virtue, namely that it manifests morally good or valuable desires and concerns, or a lack of morally bad desires. Immodesty, on the other hand, expresses and manifests egocentric vices, and as such counts as morally criticisable. This too is a rich and initially attractive account of the nature of modesty and its value. But I think it's problematic for much the same reason as Wilson's, namely that it doesn't do enough to distinguish the value of modesty from the value of pride, and so fails to address our puzzle. Modesty and pride might very well differ in terms of their patterns of attention, with the proud person being more attentive to their own qualities or to the value of these qualities than the modest person, and less attentive to the role that external factors have played with respect to the value in question. But none of these differences need evince morally problematic desires or concerns on the part of the proud person. Indeed, the case can be made that dispositions to attend to one's abilities can reliably express virtuous dispositions themselves. The proud Olympian might reliably attend to her abilities and their value because she thinks that inattention to her talents would be neglectful or sinful. She pays attention to them and their value because she regards them as a gift, let's say. And as with other gifts, attention rather than inattention seems apt as a form of gratitude. By the same token, she might be less attentive to the role that external factors have played with respect to her achievements, precisely because external factors have had little to do with her success. Instead, any external factors she's faced might have been ones that she's had to overcome: poverty, lack of parental support, indifference of funding bodies, the sexist or racist attitudes of the selection committees and fans and broadcasters, the jealousy of her teammates, and so on. The notion, therefore, that relative inattention to help from others belies a morally problematic attitude would seem to be unfounded, at least in cases like this. Indeed, it might even be the case that those who are inclined to pay attention to the help they've received from others are often more privileged than those who are not, precisely because the latter group didn't receive much help in the first place. It's not obvious, therefore, that paying attention to the help one received from others manifests a morally better attitude than paying attention to one's own abilities and the value of one's own achievements. So it's not therefore clear why modesty is a virtue of attention, whilst pride is not. The lesson to be learned from this discussion, I think, is that attempts to explain the difference in value between pride and humility that focus solely on the features of the subjects involved, whether doxastic elements like beliefs, be they accurate or inaccurate, hedonic elements like pleasure or indifference, or virtues associated with kindness and attention, seem to fail. If we are to answer our puzzle, we should look elsewhere. In the final section, I'll make the case that we should shift focus to the reactions of others to those who display pride and humility. I'll suggest that those who are proud are less highly regarded than those who are humble, because pride requires or demands esteem from us, whilst humility makes esteem a gift that we can bestow. This is the case even if pride and humility each express and manifest virtues associated with kindness and attention. Okay, so final section 4. We can, I think, better answer our question if we turn our attention away from what pride and humility are and focus instead on what pride and humility do. In short, I want to argue that pride signals that one merits esteem and a raised social standing in such a way that these are demanded or required from others. Humility, conversely, does not. This is because the humble person's lack of concern with their enhanced public standing allows or permits the observer to be equally unconcerned. For if the humble person doesn't care about being esteemed, then it's difficult to see how esteeming her is required of others. Nevertheless, humility allows the observer to give a gift of esteem, to do something that isn't required, but which expresses generosity on the observer's part. The basic thought is that we prefer expressions of humility to expressions of pride, because the former allow us to be better, because more generous people. Moreover, in allowing us to give the gift of esteem, humility also seems to express a valuable or virtuous motive, a form of respect precisely for our freedom, and one that isn't expressed by pride, which demands our esteem. As a result, we don't just find humility more agreeable, it arguably embodies a more valuable and a more virtuous motive. To see this line in more detail, let's look at a recent and plausible social functionalist account of pride developed in a paper from 2010 by Jessica Tracy, Azim Sharif, and Joey Cheng. On their account, and I quote, "Pride is a psychologically important and evolutionarily adaptive emotion that has evolved to serve specifically social functions." In particular, they argue that pride has evolved, quote, "to help individuals transform culturally valued achievements into higher social status." Tracy and her colleagues note that pride enhances status through, and I quote, "its universally recognized non-verbal expression, which may function to inform observers of the social group members of the proud individual's achievement, indicating that he or she deserves higher status." The authors support this with their own research. They write, "Using the implicit association test, we found that pride expression is rapidly and automatically perceived as a signal of high status. Such signals can be, of course, extremely valuable to the subject displaying pride, and thus who is perceived to be of high status as a result, since then they receive increased resources, attention, and other status-related benefits. But such signalling and display can also benefit observers. Those who observe the high status subjects can then, quote, more effectively navigate the status hierarchy by showing appropriate deference, knowing whom to emulate, forming productive alliances, and facilitating their own status jockey. So there's practical pressure for us to automatically show deference to those who display pride. Of course, we might ultimately come to reject these automatic impulses. We might, for instance, reflectively reject the idea that the proud person merits esteem. Perhaps they're merely basking in reflected glory. Or we might decide not to show deference to such people. So our quick and automatic perceptions of the evaluative landscape might prove to be inaccurate, and our quick and automatic tendencies to esteem others and to show deference might turn out to be unfounded. Nevertheless, it's not implausible to suppose that pride expressions instinctively call for a way of seeing the proud person, namely as one who has high status, and equally a behavioural response to the proud person, namely of esteeming and showing appropriate deference to them. Such evaluative and behavioural responses are, at least prima facie, demanded or required of us. It's plausible to think that humility can also play an important social role via its facial and bodily expression. For there seem to be standard facial and bodily expressions associated with humility or modesty too. Lowered gaze, turning away, blushing. And it might be argued that humility counts as virtuous as a result of these facial and bodily manifestations. As Bomarito knows, humility is sometimes regarded as virtuous in combating jealousy and making social interactions run more smoothly. Now, whatever such things signal, it isn't primarily that the person is associated with some achievement, nor are such expressions automatically taken to be a mark of high esteem and enhanced social standing. One reason for this is that similar expressions are associated not with achievements, but certain forms of failure, those associated with shame, guilt, and embarrassment, for instance. As a result, facial and bodily expressions associated with modesty don't seem to call for any particular response. At least they don't call for or demand the kind of evaluative and behavioural responses as those that are automatically elicited by pride expressions. If this is the case, then we can explain the difference in the aretaic status of humility and pride by appealing not to anything central to the evaluative structure of these emotions, nor to differences in their valence, nor to differences in their effects on attention, but instead to a difference in what expressions of these emotions demand of us as observers. For if the above is correct, pride expressions call for particular appraisals, namely that someone merits esteem, and particular actions, namely of esteeming that person. As noted, such requirements are only prima facie. They can be overridden by other considerations and undermined if it turns out that the person isn't suitably related to something of value or worth. But they're requirements nonetheless. As a result, observing someone displaying pride has mandatory costs in terms of appraising someone as having higher status and ensuring due deference to them. The fact that paying these costs can benefit us doesn't mean that they're not demanded from us. The same is true of moral requirements after all. Although we stand to benefit in the long run if we abide by the demands of morality, they're still demands. Things are different when it comes to humility. Expressions of humility call for neither appraisals nor behaviour on the part of the observer. Although humility requires a relation to something of value, and although we might recognise the relevant facial and bodily expressions for what they are, humility doesn't demand that anyone actually esteem the humble person in light of this relation, or show due deference to them. To see this, note that if the modest person seems indifferent or inattentive to her success or achievement, if she doesn't seem to take pleasure in this but lowers her gaze and turns away, if she directs conversation elsewhere or to the achievements of others, as per the accounts of humility explained above, then it's clear that we're permitted to do likewise. Consider, if your neighbour glowing with pride shows you pictures of his grandchildren, then there's some normative pressure on you to respond appropriately. Even if you don't think that they're the most adorable children on the planet, you're required to make the right kind of noises in response. Failure to do so would be rude, more plausibly unkind. If, on the other hand, your neighbour never draws your attention to valuable objects to which he's related, grandchildren, new car, holiday in Cuba, etc., then it seems that you are under no normative pressure to esteem him for such relations, nor show any deference to him on this account. If he doesn't care about these things, you might well say to yourself, then I'm not required to. So humility, unlike pride, doesn't demand or require some normative response. This doesn't mean that such a response wouldn't in fact be appropriate or fitting. If someone is related to some valuable object, and if this isn't, let's say, a source of shame to them, then it seems perfectly acceptable to mention this fact, to esteem them for it, and to show due deference to them as a result. Although such responses are not required, they therefore seem permissible. This means that if we do esteem or show deference to the humble person, it's something in our gift rather than a cost that's demanded from us. There may be many reasons why we'd want to esteem the humble person, as an expression of gratitude perhaps, or because in the case of public acknowledgement, we think it important that others are aware of the humble person's achievements, or because such esteem and deference accurately reflect their higher social standing. Because of this, esteeming the modest or humble person is something that is entirely fitting or appropriate to do. But this is something that humility allows us the freedom to do. This helps, I think, explain why we're inclined to value expressions of pride and humility differently, and why, as a result, we might think that the latter expresses a virtuous motive, while the former do not. We find expressions of humility much more agreeable than pride, because they allow us the freedom to act in an appropriate way, rather than demanding this from us. They allow us to make a gift of esteeming and showing deference to another person. But because such expression gives us the freedom to esteem and show deference to another, we might think that humility also expresses a measure of respect for us. Respect for our capacity to freely show esteem, to freely render unto others what they are due. So expressions of humility both allow us the freedom to esteem others, and thus strike us as more agreeable than expressions of pride. At the same time, they express respect for our capacity to esteem others, and thus strike us as a. So it's not kindness that humility and modesty express, therefore, but respect for the freedom of others to show esteem and deference as they wish. And whilst pride, as we saw, whilst pride can, as we saw, itself express kindness, pride nevertheless demands that others esteem or show deference to us, and so does not itself express respect for the capacity of others to give us the gift of esteem. As a result, expressions of pride strike us as less worthy or less valuable motives because they fail to express respect for our freedom in this way. Conclusion. We started with a puzzle to explain the difference in our aretaic assessments of pride and humility. If I'm right, this puzzle can best be solved by reflecting on what pride and humility demand or permit us to do. This helps to explain the difference in how agreeable we find these expressions and traits, and so helps to explain the difference in ranking along Humean lines. But it also helps to explain the difference in the value of the attitudes expressed themselves. Humility expresses respect for our freedom to esteem in a way that pride does not. Because of this, we're inclined to think that the motives expressed in humility are more valuable and more virtuous than those expressed in pride. Thank you.
Thanks. Do you have any questions? Okay, and if you have any follow-up, just send me a message on the chat. But yeah, let's start with Derek.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to ask about when you were discussing the hedonic indifference view, you mentioned the case of parents who are proud of their children, and as a case in which pride is virtuous and appropriate. So one interesting, and this is just kind of an observation, it looks like pride differs from modesty in that you can be proud of someone else, but you can't be modest of someone else. I don't know how that bears on your puzzle, but well, there's one thought. But then thinking about this case of the parents who are proud of their children, I wonder how this squares with the account that you want to present in the end. So it seems to me in this case, if you're proud of your children, you're not demanding a behavioral response to yourself. It's not as though you're saying, my children have done so well, therefore acknowledge my status. You may be calling for some kind of response to your children, I guess, although, well, I mean, I guess it's a little bit, it's not completely clear to me how that's going to work. It's going to be hard to read that off of the expressions and things like that. So I guess I wonder whether this pride in someone else is going to be compatible with your account, or whether in the end we just think pride in someone else is a different kind of thing than pride in oneself.
Yeah, they're really, really good questions, and I have struggled with this. I do think when we're proud of family members, it doesn't seem to fit quite the social functionalist model that Tracy et al. Proposed. I mean, you might be proud of family members even though they're kind of ne'er-do-wells. I'm proud of him. He's my brother. I can't do anything else. But he's always messes up, but I'm still proud of him because he's my brother. So I think that is a additional complication. I imagine even in the case of the proud parent on the side of the football pitch, they might be a bit irked if other parents don't congratulate them. Or say, "Oh, your daughter's fantastic. Isn't she a great captain?" And if they kind of gave it a cold shoulder, so that even they might think that some deference to them is required due to their being the parents of the captain of the football team. So I think it could work in that way. But I think we get into complications where we do think of familial relations. So I think you're quite right, Derek. That's a complication. One that's been raised before, actually, when it comes to pride. And I'm not sure what to say too much about it.
Lara?
Hello, thank you for the talk. That was very interesting. So I was wondering, given the presentation, it seems that in the cases where someone was proud, they could have been modest instead. So is it the case? And if it's not, if you think that's the case, then I'm wondering about some cases, for instance, with Black pride and LGBT pride, for instance. In those cases, it seems that you couldn't have been modest about it. And so, and also, those seems to have higher demands. It's pride because they want to be seen as being like esteemed and being an esteemed member of the society. So, because in the presentation, it seems that pride was really to be like, everybody's on the same level and suddenly you make those achievements. So you are being put on top of everybody else. But in those cases, it seems you have individuals who are like lowered and then they try to be proud and show they're proud in order to achieve the same level as everybody else in society. And so I was wondering then, like, yeah, what's the dynamic? Can you be always modest? Is it, see, because there seems to be cases where you couldn't be. So I'm wondering if this idea of like having the respect for the freedom of others, maybe it's not possible in some cases. So yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, they're fascinating points and yeah, really, really interesting. I think you're quite right. When we talk about pride, it will be relativized to groups of esteemers, perhaps, and groups of observers. It's going to have to be the case like that, because you think of football hooligans being proud of, smashing up a foreign town, for the sake of England, and you might think, well, it's genuine pride there, but there's all kinds of things that are morally wrong with that. But their group of observers are fellow football hooligans, and almost no one else is going to esteem them for that kind of reprehensible behaviour. So I think in cases of, I think the really interesting cases that you started with, cases of Black pride and LGBT pride, I think there you have an additional political motive, and in a way it's a way in which, one, to show solidarity and try and get collective emotion to build a political movement. I think that's massively, and pride is really, really good collective emotion in those instances, but also a way of promoting one's standing and self-esteem in this case by showing that you're part of a body and part of a group in which deserves to be esteemed and deserves to have a raised social standing, even if in the eyes of most of the observers in a particular culture and society, they don't have that social standing at the moment. So I think given the political motives of having collective pride, then you might think humility isn't optional in those cases, or it would undermine the practical value that collective pride has. And in those kind of cases, you might think pride might well be, because of the political prudential aspects of it, much more valuable than humility in this case. I mean, humility might be regarded as perhaps, if not cringing, then not being what's required in these instances where you walk. Yeah. Right? So I think that would be a really nice instance there, where sometimes you might think that humility is only optional if you've received a certain level of parity when it comes to social standing, and that's the kind of model there. But that's a really nice point. And yeah, in a longer paper, and more complicated paper, I mentioned the ways in which the esteem is relativized to particular groups and all the different dimensions of value in place. And this is, we're talking about, esteeming people, and that's one appropriate response, but there's many other dimensions of appropriateness and value in play here.
Cool. Thank you.
Catherine had a follow-up.
Oh yeah, so from Catherine, I wonder whether pride in this political social identity sense stands in opposition to shame rather than modesty. Yeah, that's a really nice point. And I imagine, given the political landscape, when people have often pointed out, you ought to be ashamed of your sexuality, that was a source of shame for a long time, and then that would be collectively, that's meant to be the appropriate collective response here, and it's an opposition to that. Just say, no, we're not ashamed of that. We reject that negative response, and pride is perfectly appropriate here, because this is something of value that we're related to, and we're happy to communicate this to others. So I think that's spot on.
Alison? Wait, I will unmute you.
Hi.
Okay. Yeah.
It was
Hi,
great.
Alison.
It's good to see you.
Nice to see you.
So it's fun to think about these sorts of things, and I think you probably know which route I'm going to go. So I'm thinking about when you were trying to figure out whether pride or humility is an emotion. You gave a bunch of reasons why you think they're both emotions. And then you talked some about how pride can be fitting from a moral perspective. And so when I like to think about fit outside of the realm of morality. And so there's times, right, where humor can be fitting to be amused by some joke that's deeply immoral, so I ought not be amused by it in some sort of moral sense, but it is still humorous, so it's fitting for me to be amused by it, even though it's immoral. And I'm thinking about pride seems very obvious in this sort of standard where there's something right or wrong about my pride in some sort of objective sense. If I've done something well, my pride makes sense. It's fitting for me to be proud. But then I'm wondering how to translate those sorts of questions into humility, and whether you think they can be in that sort of way, that we can assess humility in that sort of way and understand it. Obviously, there's a way it feels. It seems like there's an affective way in which it is, but whether it's an emotion episode in that sort of way that it can be assessed. Just wondering what you think.
Yeah, that's a really nice point. I mean, I'm thinking about Laura's question there. So if we bracket cases where pride has social and political value, and then think about cases where both pride and humility might be equally appropriate, the same relations are in place, then maybe we think in those cases then it's always better given the option to be modest rather than proud, because then you gift other people with the option of esteeming you. Yeah. So maybe in cases where pride's appropriate, then humility is always appropriate. Once we bracket the political cases, and that seems to be true. I mean, well, there are different levels of dimension here. So, you know, Lucy might want her parents to be beaming with pride, and they'll do that for Lucy, and that's appropriate then. But if you know, Lucy can't see her parents on the touchline, then maybe if they're modest, then that gives us other parents the gift to esteem them as well. So maybe that's better, all things considered. So it'll be different levels of commitment here. But yeah, it could be the case that in situations, political cases aside, other pragmatic considerations aside, then maybe in cases where pride is appropriate, then humility is equally appropriate, or even more, given the benefits of it.
Good, thanks.
I'm not sure about that at all, but maybe that's just off the top of my head. That might be the case. But yeah, Lara's political cases do raise problems, and maybe the political cases are you know, actually legion. You know, they cover almost all of the cases you want to think about. So it's going to be rarely the case that you get ones when they're on all fours here. But that's yeah, that might be the suggestion.
It would be really
there's nothing wrong with that. Sorry, Alison.
I was just going to say, it would be really interesting in terms of fit if they're exactly the same, and the only ways in which they differ are in terms of something concerning morality or pragmatics. But just in terms of fit, if they end up being on par, I
think that's what generates the puzzle. I think that, I mean, they can be, you know, I mean, think of Serena Williams and, you know, the exceptional achievements. And it's surely possible for her to be modest. And it would be entirely fitting for her to be really, really proud of everything she's done. But all equally, given those exceptional achievements, then it's perfectly possible for her to be modest. Given that, then they do seem to be equally fitting responses here. Same evaluative profile, same relation of belonging to you. It was her achievements after all, and yet she has, you know, yeah.
Good, thanks.
Gareth, you have a follow-up.
Hi, thanks very much.
Ask, yeah.
Oh, sorry. That was really interesting. I just wondered, they're kind of both follow-ons, one from Derek's question, but they're both kind of related. I was just wondering if the pride in others could be seen as a form of humility, like in a way that it's it becomes a kind of supreme confidence in that we're not dependent on others' opinions or whatever, so that we can kind of, you know, forgive people for not meeting our own demands. Like the brother who keeps messing up, you say, okay, I still love him because it's kind of, you know, he's doing his best. He should be proud of what he's done. And then I kind of wonder if that is of interest to kind of Lara's question about pride movements, where that could be seen as a kind of demand that, you know, let us be ourselves and exercise our virtues without you guys all demanding that we act in a certain way or demanding that we exercise our virtues in a certain way that fits with what we want. So it's almost like they're telling us, pride movements might be demanding humility of the rest of us. Just wondering.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. On the last point first, I certainly think what's demanded, if not humility, is certainly respect. And that's a respect and equal consideration. That seems to be the main demand there, and humility in the following sense. You know, not to be not to think there's any difference in social status and intrinsic value here. So, but I think respect might be the main thing that's demanded from others by political movements. In terms of the first question, is pride actually a form of humility? Could you just run the brother case by me again, Gareth? What was the thought?
I'll just read that again. Sorry. Yeah, I was just thinking because you know, earlier on you were talking about pride kind of demands certain things from other people. It demands reactions, whereas humility seems not to. And in my head, I was kind of wondering if that makes pride dependent in some way on the reactions of others. Whereas humility isn't. So it's almost, it just kind of felt to me like that is a more confident way to be. If you're you know, you're not you're not worrying about what other people think. You have some kind of internal knowledge that what you're doing is the right thing, or it is the achievement that you wanted. And you don't need other people to say how well you've done. And I'm wondering if it might be that when we then see other people who have achieved things, rather than judging them, it's kind of judging them by our own standards. So if the brother is, doing his best, say if you've got a member of the family who, takes drugs or has alcohol problems, the achievements they might make are very, very small compared to what I might want of them. But that kind of denies them the humility in some way, because they then have to base their achievements on what you demand of them rather than what they have, what they believe to be measured against their own good, kind of thing.
No, I think that point about achievement and the relativity of achievements a really nice one. I mean, and we do want to make achievement not. I mean, there's attainment and achievement. And I think achievements relative to a background of capacity and skill and effort and all these kind of things. So what could be achievement for one person might not be an achievement to not count as achievement for other people as well. So I think that's spot on. I guess yeah. I guess with respect to one's brother, it might not be. Again, I'm wondering whether humility is the right attitude there. Do you say, does humility itself allow for forgiveness? I mean, here's one difference I do think that might be in play here, and connected to your question, and something that I've thought about as well. Maybe when it comes to humility, people just aren't that bothered with social standing or esteem. So it might be the case that the proud person at some level wants to be esteemed or thinks that an increase in social standing will ultimately benefit them. Now, given connections between how others see us and our own well-being, that's a very, very deep connection for almost everyone. But you might think there could be people who just realise, that the kind of self-esteem that others want, I'm just not that bothered about, and therefore it might be easier for them to not be that concerned, and easier for them to be humble about it. But yeah, I'm not sure that entirely connects up with your question, Gareth. I'm sorry, I'm struggling.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Frederick?
I think there are some others who haven't asked a question yet. If
I have not asked anything yet. Sorry? So am I allowed to ask the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Michael, thanks for the talk.
Frederick.
So I'm wondering if there's an easy consequentialist fix to your puzzle, at least if we stay in the epistemic domain. So some people are consequentialist about epistemic virtues, and they say what really makes a character trait virtuous is how good consequences it will give you. Think that what explains the difference between humility and pride is simply that humility is truth conducive, whereas pride is not. I mean, of course, I don't have the empirical evidence to back this claim up, but say that it happens to be true that there is this difference. Would that be an easy fix to your puzzle? Thanks.
It'd be interesting to know what the evidence would look like. But I guess there are kind of external accounts of virtues, like the consequentialist account, which I think human accounts would talk about the value of virtues being in terms of their agreeableness and usefulness to other people. If it is the case that from an epistemic standpoint that humility is more valuable than pride, then that would be one thing within its favour. I'm not sure I particularly like purely externalist accounts of virtues. I think they miss an important connection with the motivational aspect of it and the kind of appraisal structure that I've been talking about. But I guess, yeah, I mean, when you think, maybe pride does, maybe humility does have some social advantages, you know, Bomarito talks about and Wilson talks about, you know, the way it eases social interaction, and we find humble people more pleasant. Then again, pride has really, really important social consequences. It's really good to know who's skillful. It's really good to know the people in our society who've achieved stuff, and then we can rely on them to achieve more stuff in the future. And so without pride, I think pride, the reason why pride's around, in a very, very crude account, is that we have a social need to know who we can rely on when it comes to possessing certain kinds of virtues necessary for achieving things. So you might think, yeah, that the external consequences of pride might outweigh the external social consequences of humility in that case. Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, it'd be interesting to see what kind of evidence could show that humility has epistemic advantages here. But certainly when you know, yeah, for every person that's massively confident in their scientific hypothesis and will just pursue it come what may, and eventually they're proved right, versus the person who's very, very open to countervailing evidence and is not confident necessarily in their and you know and will be humble with respect to their abilities, and that can be clearly virtuous in many intellectual endeavors as well. We tend to prefer the second person too, but yeah, it's an interesting question, what that would look like, the empirical work. I don't know anything about that, but that's a really interesting point. Thank you.
Thanks.
I can unmute.
Sorry. Yeah, Catherine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, thanks, Michael. That was really interesting for lots of reasons. So I've been thinking a lot about imposter syndrome. So there's lots of connections there. But I'm going to try and sneak in two things. So one is a kind of positive comment, and then a question. So and this is about your own theory at the end about the generosity and so on. I thought one thing that was really nice about that is it helps explain why when you interact with a modest person and then you try and give them a compliment or sort of recognize their achievement, it can be kind of annoying if they're too modest, right? If they try and sort of fob you off and say, "Oh no, it was terrible, really," or no, don't mention it, or But so there's something there about I think you're right that we like to kind of give these kind of praise and compliments to modest people, but then we like them to appreciate the compliments as well. So that all fits together nicely. I guess the kind of more critical thought would be to say that if you're right that this is why we value pride more than modesty, maybe it doesn't reflect very well on us, right? So it's all about me and me liking to feel generous in recognizing your achievement instead of being required to recognize your achievement. Well, why shouldn't I be required to recognize it if it was a good achievement? And it's kind of reminding me a little bit of kind of rich people who would prefer to support things through their charitable donations instead of just being forced to pay tax, right? So in a way, it's good if they give their money, and that's generous, and that gives them the opportunity to be generous. But it's not really admirable of them. I mean, I think they should be happy to be required to pay tax rather than just kind of generously offering their charitable giving. So I wonder whether there's something similar here, right? That if we do in fact prefer to be generous with our sort of compliments and recognition and offer it freely instead of just having it demanded of us, maybe that is what we're like, but maybe that doesn't reflect well upon us.
Good. That's a really lovely point. I do think there is something a little bit dubious with kind of social functionalist accounts, which say that this is the ultimate explanation has to do with one's own welfare and one's own happiness and one's own well-being, and it makes it and that's a problem with human accounts of virtue. In what's agreeable to us determines what counts as virtue. I think there's something to that, and I think, but then again, I might think that the expression of modesty on behalf of the modest person might express a more generous motive than an expression of pride, which really does require that you esteem me. So in a way, yeah, you might feel better because I'm giving you the opportunity here, and then that's one of the sources of you thinking that humility is better. But insofar as the humble person does give you the opportunity, then if it's not a kindness, as Wilson said, it certainly seems to respect your respect you in your choices and your ability to gift rather than demanding it of you. There's because demands are really. Have you seen the film Parasite?
Yeah.
And there's a lovely bit towards the end when I'm not giving anything away for not seeing it, but there's the party at the really posh house, and they will say, oh, don't bring anything, but you know full well that you really have to bring. The kid just has to get a gift here, and so it's a bit like that. But I think genuinely giving people the option to do that does express a morally praiseworthy motive. So maybe that's the source. But yeah, I think you're quite. If you just focus on why we like it more, it's good for us to give gifts, and there might be something a bit dubious about that. I think there's something dubious about accounts of pride on the same lines as well. I mean, the reason why we tie pride so much to responsibility is that we don't want to, give deference and esteem to too many people, even if So it's a one way of narrowing down. So yeah, I'm not going to give you too much deference because your family did this achievement. I'm much more inclined to give it to you because then it saves costs on my account. But that doesn't tie into the intrinsic value of any of the achievements here at all. So I think the reward is there. Yeah. And I think, as Alison said before, there's so many different dimensions of fittingness and appropriateness here. In one sense, it might be entirely morally praiseworthy to give someone the option, but also it makes the appraiser feel good, and that might be a slightly egoistic motivation to build an entire theory of virtue on. So no, I'm with you on that one.
Thanks.
Yeah, I have a question too. I was wondering how you would understand cases of Christianity that people maybe go to a priest or a monk, and this monk or a priest is very modest, and because they're so modest, they feel like they can trust him to give them advices about life and spiritual advices. So it seems like this modesty in some cases can give us a reason to defer to these people, to trust them in a sense, maybe to give us advice about life.
So there might be this connection. I think humility is usually standardly taken to be one of the many components of wisdom. So at least if you do surveys of the folk, and actually lots of psychological empirical work suggests that wise people have these characteristics, and being modest or humble is one of the characteristics or components of wisdom. So in that sense, there might well be a connection in our thinking between someone who's modest and humble and someone who we ought to ask for advice, because that's another characteristic of the wise person. They're appropriate sources of advice about our decision making. So I think that there would be something about it. Someone who's very, very full of themselves might not be. Yeah, it's difficult to think of the wise person as someone who's very overly proud and very full of themselves, and that doesn't chime at all well with our assessment of who has wisdom. But yeah, I think there might be that connection. Did you think there was something dubious about the kind of religious aspect and people being humble and therefore being more trustworthy? Well, Catherine will know about all this, so I'm not going to say anything about trustworthiness. But being humble and therefore being more trustworthy, or better sources of advice beyond the kind of wisdom connection.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe it depends on your background. Some people will take it that if somebody was proud, they wouldn't ask them for advice. They would go to the modest kind person for it. They would not defer to the proud person.
Yeah.
So
now I'm thinking, I want to take my car for its service to the really boastful garage that gets all the awards, because I want rather than someone says, I'm not that good at fixing cars, right? Well, I'm not going to go to you. So there might be cases where we do, we want the person who expresses the opposite trait.
But can this be used as a counterexample to your account? I'm not sure. I'm just thinking it this way.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I mean, there's always going to be cases when once you wheel in lots and lots of practical dimensions where there'll be instances where pride is going to be better than humility. And there's large-scale political ones, and they're the cases that Lara brought up before. And there might be other practical cases where, you know, it's better if you display pride for the sake of your children. It's better to display humility because you'll really annoy people if you don't. But so all these different factors, yeah. So I think it's the big picture is going to be massively more complicated. This was a very basic, rather crude account of one level of difference between them, but nevertheless, I do think there's something to the idea that they differ in virtue status because of this, because of what they enable.
Okay, thanks. Simon?
Hi, Michael. Good to see you.
All right, Simon.
So I know absolutely nothing about this area, so here goes. I was thinking about the social functionalist account. So if I'm understanding this rightly, this analyzes the emotions themselves, assuming that you're right, that that's what they are, in terms of their social function. And I'm wondering what it would take to show that that was correct, rather than merely showing that the expressions of certain emotions have social functions. Yeah. It certainly seems as though a lot of the examples you were talking about involved the expression either through verbal expression or just through one's demeanor or something like that. And you might think, well, you can talk about the social function of all sorts of things without thinking that those things can be understood in terms of their social function. Yeah. So I suppose that there's a little bit more I want to say, but the question really is, what's the reason for thinking that there's a tight fit there, that these things can be analyzed in terms of social function rather than just thinking that the expression of them has social function? Then the other bit, which might be a way of getting at this, but I'm not completely sure, it might just turn out to be a separate point, so I apologize if it's unconnected. But I've been thinking about whether it's possible to be proud and humble both at the same time. And it seemed to me that there might be some cases that suggest that it is possible to have both of those feelings, whereas one might think that it's not possible to be expressing or manifesting both of them simultaneously. And if that's right, then that would be a reason for thinking that the emotion itself and its social function might come apart. And the sort of case I was thinking about that might suggest that it's possible to have both emotions at the same time would be something like a recovering drug addict who's managed to stay clean for 30 days, let's say, and they feel proud of themselves for having done that. But at the same time, they may be very humble, given the context of the achievement. They're not about to start genuinely bragging about it to people. So that was a line of thought anyway, and I just wondered what you think about it.
Good. That's fascinating, Simon. In terms of the cases, I do think, there's a difference between being proud and bragging about something. And I guess that might be a case where, thinking of the phenomenology of it, your emotions might be flipping or switching between at one moment feeling and being proud, and at the same time, well, there's episodes of emotions, and then kind of long-term emotional states, and then we have longer-term emotional traits. So it might be the case that, you know, when the person reflects on, 30 days clean, they feel really proud of themselves, and then they realize, God, what has this done to my family and friends? And they're humbled by all of this. I mean, humbled by, because their sponsor is 10 years clean or something like that, and they're sponsored by, they're humbled when they compare themselves to him. So that could be a case where the emotions are flipping. It could be the case that you have episodes of emotion whilst having a longer term emotion that's quite opposite. So you might be a calm person and occasionally just fly off the handle. That seems to be perfectly okay. So I think in those cases, I guess I'd say that one, I mean, that there's flipping between the emotions, and one emotional expression is following the other one. At least that's my initial inclination. In terms of the social function and the expression, that sounds exactly right, and it puts pressure on the what am I explaining here? The value of expression of emotions, or the kind of aretaic status of the emotions, or the traits themselves. I think that's exactly right. I think social functionalists, as far as I know, will want to say that certainly Tracy, Sheriff, and Cheng want to give a kind of evolutionary account of why we express pride. So pride has evolved to do all these things, and one of them is to express the relation between ourselves and our achievements to other people. And so that is tied very closely to the nature of what pride is, in the same way that pain expression is tied very closely to the nature of pain here. And I guess there's a good reason for that. You might not get the benefits without the very close connection between the state itself and its expression. It's really hard to fake. I think it's probably really hard to fake pride. We're generally good at when people are basking in reflected glory. All those people in Edinburgh who say, Sean Connery was my postman, or my parents' postman, or my grandparents' postman, something like, basking in that kind of reflected glory. And you might say, well, that's not genuine pride, and whatever they're doing there, or the plastic football fan, So I think that there are those cases, but I think insofar as you might think there's a strong correlation between expressions of the emotion and the emotion itself, then you might say you're not going to get reliable expression without being in the state itself, just as reliable correlation between pain as a state and pain expressions. And you're not going to get the social benefits of expressing pain, namely help from people who are sympathetic to you without being in pain. So I think there's that connection. But in terms of whether I've shown anything more than, well, whether the social functionalist account can show more than here's the value of the expressions of the traits, and you can infer from that here's the value of the traits. No, I think there's a gap there. I think you're right to point that out.
Just to clarify, is it still a social functionalist account if there is a lot more to say about the nature of pride and humility, but one of their functions is the social one?
Yeah, and I think the account might well be that the social function takes priority, and that's why it's survived, and that's why it's persisted. Now, if you're not a social functionalist, you say what's really characteristic about these things are the appraisal structure, or behavioural impulse, or its effects on cognition and attention, and that's really at the core of what the trait is. But if you're a social functionalist, say really it's the kind of facial and bodily expression that captures it. So if you James thought that was at the heart of the emotion, it's the feelings, and Darwin thought it was a facial and bodily expression. But I think people who work in philosophy of emotion don't focus on bodily expression anywhere near enough, and I think you have these puzzles about our assessment of the value of certain emotional states and traits that are often best solved by looking at the effects on other people and what observers think about the expression, rather than looking at any differences within the emotion itself. At least that was my thought here, because when you look at Bomarito's recent account and Wilson's account, looking at these differences, I think that's a problem with the kind of epistemic accounts of humility as well. I'm not sure they work as well there, but that's my tentative suggestion. But I'm not I know I'm not a card-carrying social functionalist by any means. I'm using it.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Derek?
So I was thinking that something that seems characteristic of humility in some people, or on some occasions, is wanting to call attention to the achievements of others. So if we're trying to praise Andy Murray and he says, oh, Wimbledon, that's all well and good, but it's really the NHS workers who deserve recognition. That's a very modest kind of move to make. But I wonder how to make sense of that on your kind of account. If the value of modesty is that it respects our freedom to acknowledge and value things appropriately, it seems like the person who calls attention to something, even if not themselves, isn't really, like if Andy Murray is saying, well, you need to be respecting the NHS workers, that's not acknowledging and respecting our freedom to value things as we choose. So it seems like that's exhibiting the same problem that you're seeing, that kind of modesty is exhibiting the same the same problem that you're seeing with pride.
Good. So maybe in that case, yeah. I mean, you're given the freedom to esteem Andy Murray or not as you see fit, but you're not, because what he's pointed out is really, yeah. I guess I mean, if it's constitutive of modesty that you focus attention on the achievements of other people, I think this might be Bomarito's line, then that would be a problem for my account. But if I don't think it is, then that is a kind of consequence of what happens if you do. And therefore, Andy can generate new moral demands insofar as he points out that, look at what the NHS are doing. So I think Bomarito would have to say, well, he says either you don't pay attention to your own traits, or you direct attention elsewhere. So I think he would yeah, my account would conflict with his on that point, but I don't think I'm committed to saying that it's necessarily part of humility that you direct attention elsewhere, although you can do, and therefore in so doing you generate new moral obligations. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Laura?
Okay, so I've been thinking about my question/comment, and then with everything that has been said, and Catherine's comment about pride being opposed to shame in the case of social pride seems to me to be correct, but not telling the full story. Because there seems to be in pride movements a sense in which it is valuable and you're proud because you survived despite the circumstances. Like you were able to overcome this, and for instance, you thrived. You had your community and all that, even though the society was telling you that you were not fitting. And so there's a sense in which it's not opposed to shame. It really is, you're proud of your achievements and the fact that you survived and went so far and like still made a life for yourself. And so I'm thinking then the way to distinguish maybe in your account the idea of like, why are some types of pride not as morally seen as badly as maybe like, and why it's not possible to be modest, is that when I look at the last sentence on your handout, which is that it is the respect for the freedom of others, because you want to respect their freedom, that you are going to be modest. But I think in some cases of pride, you cannot respect the freedom of others, because what you're actually proud of is that you overcame the fact that they had no respect for you. And in those cases, you cannot give them the freedom because they already took your freedom, and that's what because you're claiming that back. That's why you're proud. And so maybe in those cases, that's why we have this distinction. And I think it would be difficult to find cases of like morally well-seen pride cases that are not actually attached to the fact that people are proud of the fact that they overcame the case of people wanting to take their freedom away from them. So when we think of like Black pride, LGBT pride, also many body positivity movements, when we're telling, for instance, women to be like, hey, you should not eat that way, you should dress that way, and all of that, and then you're proud of like reclaiming your body and doing whatever you want with it. And so maybe that's, I don't know, that was a thought I had, and because nobody else had a question, I was like, I'm just going to throw it in here.
Could you just repeat the bit about genuine, is it collectively virtuous pride will always require taking back?
Oh, you're reclaiming.
Yeah, I was a bit lost towards the end of that.
Oh, you reclaim your freedom. So
Right.
for instance, in LGBT pride, you will reclaim your right to love who you want.
Mm-hmm.
You will, or for instance, reclaim your freedom to have the gender you want to have and not the one society dictated on you. On a body positivity movement, you will reclaim your freedom to have the body you want and not be ashamed of it, and not have to follow society's dictates. Dictates? No, okay, no, that's a word in French only. Yeah. Or also with Black pride, this idea that like you're reclaiming the right, for instance, not to be followed by the police at night, or not be seen as a criminal, or being able to also marry who you want and have the same rights. So
good. So I think then it maybe it's a distinction between certain rightly politicized cases of pride requiring not just not esteem but respect and equal treatment.
Yeah.
And whereas other cases of pride require raising in social status and particular kinds of esteem that in the case of humility are genuinely optional. It's optional whether I esteem that person or not, but it's not the case. It's not optional for me to respect that person or not. I ought to respect all people equally without you know. So I think that would be a point there, that when it's cases of legitimate collective pride, then what's demanded is respect and not simply esteem or a raise in social standing. There, that seems to be spot on.
Yeah.
And then you get in really interesting cases of illegitimate collective pride.
Oh yeah.
And you wonder about, I think, of white pride. So white pride movements, and often what's going on there, you might think these, you know, look at the people involved and you think there's little else going on apart from reprehensible racist attitudes, and yet you think there's a movement there precisely because these people, they're not getting the self-esteem that they, or not getting the social standard they think they merit.
Also straight pride.
Yeah, there's similar structural features there, but yeah, in one case it's really legitimate, in other cases it's not. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
Jimena?
There it is. Thank you very much for the talk and the discussion. It's been very interesting. So I've been wondering about, I really like the way you distinguish between pride and modesty, and that one is demanding, one is demanding for others to recognize an achievement, and the other one is leaving some space for others to recognize it, but it's not a demand, it's not required. But I've been wondering how this fits with different social and cultural contexts. So Savas put forward the example of perhaps religious modesty, right? Where it is highly esteemed that one is modest. But also there might be some contexts in which pride might be very highly esteemed, right? And I've been wondering, well, why would that be? And I was thinking that perhaps there's a way in which it also shows some kind of respect towards others as moral agents, some kind of respect in that, well, surely people can see value where there is value, or something like that. So I've just been wondering about whether this kind of diminishes the difference between them depending on those different social contexts.
That's a really nice point. I think there'll be very, very many different social contexts in which our assessments of these might vary. I mean, there might be cases where, just as there is with other traits, think of, you know, curiosity being highly regarded in educational contexts, especially with, you know, you're educating young children. Curiosity was a sin in Christian theology. Why? Because you shouldn't be curious because you know everything. It's in the good book. Should be, you know, striving for knowledge. It's all there. So you might, so in different contexts you will get different evaluations of particular kinds of traits, and no doubt, as Lara's pointed out in her comments, there'll be cases where pride is extremely valuable and extremely valued. In other cases it might not be, and given other circumstances we might think humility or modesty is much more virtuous and much more valuable in those circumstances. And so I think that the question to ask is, you know, with these contexts, what's doing the driving for our evaluative assessments of the different traits in these cases? And I think there might be other pragmatic factors, other practical factors here, other interpretations of what's really important in these circumstances. I think the religious case would be one like that. You know, I think if you want people to focus only on the Bible, then, you know, if all truth is in there, then they ought not to be doing their own investigations they ought not to be doing science, because, you know, they've got you see those social contexts. So yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that the kind of picture here is going to be universally true in all contexts, because in most contexts lots of other values will be in place, and this generates a really interesting complexities and controversies here. And so maybe you're thinking, well, what's so good about this kind of picture if it's not going to apply across the board? But I think as long as we acknowledge there'll be other different values in place in a lot of these occasions, then it will be, what I've said here, I think, is hopefully compatible with that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other question? We still have some time. Else, thank you, Michael, for your talk. It was great. It's very interesting.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure, and nice to see you all, and to think about these things as well. And enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. See you soon.
Yeah, you too.
Cheers. Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye.